Hello, I'm Ros Atkins in Washington. This is BBC News. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump continue to make their respective cases to voters. We'll assess another tumultuous week in the US presidential election campaign. For Trump, concerns over the level of crime remain a focus. BBC Verify will assess the statistics he's pointing to. In North Dakota, a judge has struck down an abortion ban that was passed last year. A leading pollster will examine how important this issue is to voters. And then there's fracking. As Trump highlights Harris's shift in position on this, we'll unpack why fracking matters politically. Well, across this half hour, we're going to look in detail at another extraordinary week in this US election campaign. We've had the debate, rallies, a Trump press conference, albeit one where there were no questions for the first half an hour. And then there have been all sorts of clashes and claims on fracking, on crime, on abortion, and on cats and dogs being eaten in Ohio. There's no evidence on that, by the way. It has been a lot. And we'll start with the issue of abortion, because last year, the US Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, which guaranteed a woman's right to obtain an abortion. And the political and legal consequences of that have continued to play out. It was a major part of the Trump-Harris debate on Tuesday. And then on Thursday, there was a further development. In North Dakota, a judge struck down the state's near-total ban on abortion, saying North Dakota's constitution gives women a fundamental right to choose abortion before fetal viability. Well, Elizabeth Smith is with the Center for Reproductive Rights, the organisation that argued on behalf of the plaintiffs in North Dakota. And Ms. Smith joins us now. Thank you very much indeed for your time. What's your reaction to the ruling?
This was an incredible ruling and is the first time that a state that totally banned abortion in the US, one of those 14 states, has seen abortion be reaffirmed as a right under the state constitution. So this was not a decision by voters based on a state constitutional amendment. This was a judge saying, no, the North Dakota Constitution protects the fundamental right to make decisions about bodily autonomy free from government interference. This is a wonderful day for people in North Dakota and across the country.
But you'll be aware that already there's been notification that there'll be an appeal.
Absolutely, and we fully expect appeals to go up to the North Dakota Supreme Court. But the opinion that the trial court judge wrote, as you quoted from, is really strong and clearly lays out the case that the North Dakota Constitution protects the right to choose abortion.
Do you recognise there's a tension here between the law as it's seen by this judge and by some of the state's politicians who voted this law through last year?
Absolutely. And we've seen that in North Dakota, and we've seen that in states across the country. The vast majority of Americans support abortion rights and want abortion care to be legal and accessible. And what we've seen in the 14 states where abortion is criminally banned is that politicians are completely out of step with their constituents. And in fact, in many instances, it is gerrymandered state legislatures that are making this decision, again, out of step with the people living in those states.
What practical difference do you think this will make immediately for women in North Dakota?
So we have to recognize that there was one abortion clinic in North Dakota prior to the Dobbs decision, which overruled Roe v. Wade. That clinic has since moved and is no longer in North Dakota. So what this will mean is that abortion will be available in hospitals and by certain providers, but to restart a clinic and reopen a clinic is a major undertaking. So one of the goals of laws like North Dakota's is to shut down access by shutting down clinics and by sending providers outside of the state. So to restart access in the state will be a major undertaking.
You'll, of course, be well aware how political this issue has become, not least during an election campaign. You will have watched the debate on Tuesday night. How did you assess the two candidates as they spoke on this particular issue?
So I want to start by saying the Center for Reproductive Rights is a 501c3 organization, so we do no electioneering. But I think that you see two very stark different pictures of America. And I think voters have a real choice about whether they want to ensure that abortion rights are again legal across every state in this country or not. And as we have seen in every poll since Dobbs, the vast majority of Americans support abortion rights and want abortion care to be legal and accessible across the country.
And what do you say to the argument made by Donald Trump and some of his supporters that this should be a matter that's decided at the state level?
I think we can only look at the limitations on voting rights, the limitations on democracy, and the gerrymandering of state legislatures in states like my home state of Texas to really demonstrate that that's not possible. The vast majority of Texans, for example, support abortion rights, but Texas currently has one of the most draconian abortion bans that if you violate it, you could potentially be facing 99 years in prison, criminal fines, etc. So Texans have no avenue to affect what the law is on abortion in their state. And it is only a new federal right, either through a federal statute or through a new federal constitutional amendment, that will ensure that everyone across the country can access abortion care where they live.
Elizabeth Smith, thank you very much indeed for joining us on BBC News. So we've begun this 30 minutes considering the issue of abortion. The next issue I want to turn to is that of the level of crime in the US. This also came up in Tuesday's debate and in the fallout from the debate too. Here's Merlin Thomas from BBC Verify.
Trump has been going hard on crime, particularly Kamala Harris's record on it. And this really came to a head on the presidential debate on Tuesday when he said that crime was going through the roof. And the ABC News moderator picked him up on this and challenged him.
Crime here is up and through the roof. Despite their fraudulent statements that they made, crime in this country is through the roof. And we have a new form of crime. It's called migrant crime. And it's happening at levels that nobody thought possible.
President Trump, as you know, the FBI says overall violent crime is actually coming down in this country. But Vice President Harris,
the FBI
right.
Well, the thing is, they're both referring to different data sets. So Trump's figures are correct. They're correct according to the national crime stats that were published today on Thursday after the debate on Tuesday. And the figures that the ABC News moderator was referring to are those published by the FBI. And they only include crimes reported to law enforcement.
And you and I are both part of BBC Verify, and one of the challenges when we take on an issue such as this is that there are lots of different sources of data and information on any given policy issue.
Exactly, and we've been looking through the difference in those data sets and the nuances that they both come with. And for example, the figures that Trump quoted, they are based on numbers that are on a nationwide survey of victims of crime. So they include people who might not have reported to victims of crime. So they include people who might not have reported to the police as well. And it's important to say as well that it includes 2020, which was a COVID year. So remember, we don't know what that will have done to the opportunities for crime in that year as well. And the survey does add, it must be said, that the 2023 rate of violent crime was higher than those of 2020 and 2021. So, and they also say it was not statistically different to that of 5 years ago in 2019.
Thanks to Merlin Thomas. So crime and abortion were two of many issues that came up during Tuesday's debate. But let's try and assess which ones of these issues matter the most to voters. Anthony Salvanto is CBS News polling director, and he's joining us live on the BBC. Anthony, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's easy, isn't it, to look at the headline national polls, but there's so much detail beneath them. Let's start with what your understanding is of the major factors that decide which choice the voters make.
Good evening, Ross. Well, look, the two you've been talking about are important, but the one I want to start with, and I'll show you this, it's inflation and it's the economy. That's something that most voters do say is a major factor. And in fact, one of the reasons this race is so close is that for those who say not only that inflation is a major factor in their vote, but also that they feel that their incomes are not keeping pace with inflation, they tend to be voting for Donald Trump in large measures. And one of the reasons, if you unpack that, is that when we ask people, how do you remember the economy when Donald Trump was president? Quite frankly, they're looking back past COVID to the pre-COVID times, and they're saying they remember it as good. And so that's one of the factors that's really underpinning a lot of his standing in the polls, Ross. It's inflation, it's the economy, and the feeling, the retrospective feeling that the economy was better when he was president, Ross.
And I'm curious, Anthony, do these major factors vary according to whether a voter is likely to vote Republican or Democrat?
Well, they do. In fact, Republicans are even more likely to say not only that the economy is a factor, but that the economy isn't good. And part of that is the partisanship wrapped up. We see that a lot around campaigns. But let me point out something that's sort of pushing back against that a little bit. And I'll show it to you here on the screen. And that is what happens when reproductive rights, when abortion is said to be a major factor in people's votes. You see these numbers, you're getting very sizable margins who then are saying they're voting for Harris based on that issue. So again, to your larger point, it's a combination of factors. And at some points in the campaign, you see that back and forth about what people should decide based upon and not just what their vote is. And that's one of those factors that's helping out Harris right now.
Now, next, I've got to ask you a question I'm sure you're asked an awful lot because there's such a focus on these crucial swing states. How are things looking, in particular, in Michigan, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin?
Tight, close, even. You can sort of unpack your words and adjectives for all of that. You know, one of the things that I'll show you those states in particular, and this is what I mean by even, I always point out to people, you see estimates like this, remember that all of these are within the margin of error. All of these are highly dependent on what you classify as a likely voter. I think preferences are very tight and very locked in at this point, but there is some variance in who might actually show up to vote. And that explains a lot of what you see in the campaign, where oftentimes you're seeing the campaigns talk to some of their base voters because they want to motivate them. In fact, one of the real interesting dynamics that's gotten this race to be so close versus when Joe Biden was the nominee or going to be the nominee for the Democrats is that there's been a surge in Democratic enthusiasm since Harris became the nominee. They've now increasingly been saying that they're likely to turn out, and that's kind of come up and matched the Republican enthusiasm. And there again is another big factor behind that tight race, Ross.
There's one more thing I need to ask you about, Anthony. I remember in 2016 and in 2020, the pollsters had some difficulties assessing support for Donald Trump and quite frequently underestimated his support. Presumably, the polling industry has looked at its approach to try and make sure that doesn't happen this time.
I always emphasize two things. One is to look at the state-by-state polls. I think one of the things about 2016 is that a lot of folks were looking at the national race, which quite frankly, at least from our point of view, our polling was spot on. But in the states, you had Donald Trump winning the Electoral College, that state-by-state contest, even though Hillary Clinton won the national popular vote. I think now there's better communication about the fact that this is decided state by state, and I'll certainly keep emphasizing that. But number two, it goes back again to turnout. When you look at polls, look at the ones that talk about the likely voters, because quite frankly, it's that smaller percentage of people who might be on the fence about whether or not to turn out. Pollsters always wrestle with looking at that behavioral aspect of this. Will they or won't they show up? Frankly, campaigns do too. And that's something that when you see the measures, you know that there's going to be variance in that. And that when you hear that cliche about it all coming down to turnout, that's what you see in the polling. That's what you see even in small shifts in the polling. And that's what you're seeing this year, Ross.
Anthony, that is so helpful. Thank you very much indeed. That's Anthony Salvanto, CBS News polling director. Well, one issue that we know is especially important in many swing states, those swing states Anthony's just been talking about, is fracking. It's a technique where pressure is applied to shale rock in order to release gas and oil. And Donald Trump has been very keen to highlight that Kamala Harris's position on fracking has changed since 2019 when she was calling for a ban based on environmental and climate concerns. Well, for more on this, here's Ben Geeman from Axios.
I think it's fair to say that the Biden administration has recognized the need for the U.S. to be a robust oil and natural gas producer. And by definition, that is something that is going to include a lot of fracking. I mean, one thing that has influenced this a great deal on the natural gas side is the fact that during the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you've obviously had this European effort to move away from Russian oil and gas supplies, and U.S. liquefied natural gas exports have helped fill some of that gap. Similarly, when oil prices were rising and there have been efforts to move away from Russian oil, you also saw the Biden administration encouraging producers to open the taps even more. So it has candidly been a somewhat mixed message from an administration that is both taking unprecedented steps on climate change, but also, I think, recognizes the geopolitical and economic leverage that our fossil fuel production provides. And from a raw political standpoint, there's very little tolerance for rising gasoline prices and rising heating costs. And from that standpoint, you've also seen the administration try to make sure that it doesn't undercut itself heading into these elections.
And you say there's been a mixed message from the Biden administration. Nonetheless, it is fair, isn't it, that this approach is a long way from what Kamala Harris used to advocate towards the end of the last decade?
I think that's absolutely right. So, if we wind back to 2019, when she was running her own campaign for the Democratic nomination for president that ultimately obviously went to Joe Biden, she was among a fairly large number of candidates who all felt that they had to run to the left, to the political left. And in so doing, she called for a ban on fracking. Now, candidly, that's something that's a little bit more messaging than it would be reality, because outright banning it would require an act of Congress, and there's simply not enough political appetite for that, or even close. Now, a ban on fracking was not the position of the top of the ticket when she became the vice presidential nominee. And she said at the time that Joe Biden would not ban fracking. And so that's something that has, but her 2019 comments to this effect have certainly come back to be a big thing now that she's running her own campaign for president. And Republicans at every turn are trying to remind voters, especially in the state of Pennsylvania, which is absolutely pivotal and a huge natural gas producer. They've been looking to remind voters that she once took this position. Now, Harris, in recent weeks, both in an interview with CNN and the very recent debate she had with Donald Trump, she has made very clear that this is no longer her position. She says that the U.S. can grow its clean energy posture and attempt to confront climate change, even while encouraging these types of domestic fossil fuel supplies. And in fact, we've seen her very much pivot to the center by openly touting and boasting about the rise in U.S. oil and natural gas production.
Well, clearly both candidates think it's an important issue. They are both referencing it frequently in their different ways. I wonder whether their calculation is that this is about keeping gas prices down for Americans, or is it to do with generating and keeping jobs within the energy market?
I think it's a mix of a lot of different things. If you look at some of the Republican criticisms of Kamala Harris, it's this idea that while U.S. production has been rising in recent years, that a Democratic administration and already the behavior of the Biden administration is sowing the seeds to deter investment that would allow continued increases in this production, whether that's through offering fewer federal areas for lease or putting on new types of environmental regulations across the board. Now, when it comes to Republicans, I think this is also part of the message that they want to sort of say that the Democratic climate change agenda is something that is ultimately going to cost U.S. jobs in these industries, right? And so that's why, again, to bring this back to Pennsylvania, this is absolutely a must-win state for Kamala Harris. And while polling shows somewhat mixed views about fracking in Pennsylvania, certainly the votes that she needs to pick up in that state have led to the conclusion that she needs to sprint away from this prior call for banning this practice.
So we've considered the issue of fracking. We've also considered the issues of abortion and of crime. And we've looked at how the polling fits into all of this too. But let's just step back and consider where this week leaves the race with Democrat strategist, political strategist, Joy Cheney, who's with us. Joy, thank you very much indeed for your time. I'm assuming you felt that the debate went well for Kamala Harris. So let's look forwards. What should she do now?
So now she should do what she's doing. She needs to hit the campaign trail. She needs to go to all the battleground states and, be aiming for turning out her base voters and expanding that base, and also trying to convert those who are moderate or Republicans, letting them know they have a home with the campaign. And then just so she can shut everyone up, probably doing an interview or two.
I was going to ask you about that. It might be time to sit down and let a few journalists ask her some questions.
Absolutely. I think that is always a part of the plan. But the truth is, she's doing direct to consumer, if you will, right? She's going straight to the voters on the campaign trail. They're hearing her. She's hearing from them. They're asking the toughest questions, right? It's so funny. We just had that fracking conversation. The real question, if you're in Pennsylvania, is where do you stand with fracking now? They don't really care where she was before. It only matters what's happening today.
And how do you assess her messaging on issues such as fracking and on gun control? Because on both during the debate, it sounded like she was trying to offer reassurances to Republicans who may be considering coming across to her.
Sure. I mean, I think that what she's learned as vice president is you're president for everyone, right? And so while you might have some personal views that may be to the left or to the right, as the case may be, of the electorate, that ultimately you're going to do what makes right for the vast majority of Americans and what makes right in terms of policy. So I don't think there's any surprise there. Americans shift and change positions all the time. That is natural. It is unnatural to take a position, never change, even in the face of facts and changing circumstances. So I think what she's doing is quite right, is to talk about where her values are. Those are unwavering, but where she may be on any particular issue, especially ones that, these are not moral issues, right? These are ones of different positions that might change over time. That in the case of fracking, there might have been a shift there. In the case of some other issues, there might have been a shift, but it's not like there's a long list. She's been pretty consistent.
OK, Joy, so that is a Democrat perspective on the political strategy Kamala Harris may pursue. Let's get a Republican perspective, too. Ron Bonjean is also joining us. Ron, thank you very much for being with us on the BBC. Talk to me about where you think this week leaves Donald Trump and how he should plot his way forward.
Well, first of all, I was just listening to the fracking conversation, and I would just want to say that I noticed that Kamala Harris didn't really talk much about the fracking issue after she was exposed by Trump, and really didn't talk about energy policy. I have a feeling in the next couple of weeks we're going to see some type of energy policy come out from the Harris campaign to try to mitigate that damage. But what I think is going to happen after this debate is that, first of all, no one landed a fatal blow during that debate. Kamala Harris, I think, truly won it. On the merits. She had her arguments down. She had Donald Trump on defense, but there was no death blow. And I think that we just have to see how far she'll move the needle now.
But Ron, you're talking quite a lot about Kamala Harris, but I'm interested to know what you think about Donald Trump and his performance in that debate and what he should do. For example, we know there's a lot of search interest at the moment in Donald Trump and cats and dogs. Is that really what you want your candidate to be having people looking him up for? Surely they should be looking him up for policy.
Yeah, probably not. We probably don't want to have that happen. No one would. I think Donald Trump needs to get focused. He was very unfocused during that debate. He kept Kamala Harris on defense regarding immigration, and I thought his attack at the end was very good about saying, hey, if you have all these plans, then why didn't you do them during this administration? You're vice president. Why haven't you initiated any of these things you're talking about? He should have done that at the beginning and really hammered home time after time after time. Now going forward, what he needs to do is start talking about kitchen table issues that people really care about. They don't care about cats or dogs. They don't care about what happened in the last election or his list of grievances. They want to know if he's going to help solve problems that they care about. I don't think we're going to see much of a change out of Donald Trump. He is who he is. We all know that. So at the same time, Kamala Harris has a lot of catching up to do. So Trump is a known quantity, and he's out there. He's constantly, and Kamala Harris is trying to educate these undecideds that she's a credible alternative. So there's a real challenge there for her.
Both of you, thank you very much indeed. That's Joy Cheney and Ron Bonjean. Let's quickly go back to Anthony Salvanto, CBS polling director, who's still with us. Because, Anthony, I've got to ask you a question that I know a lot of people are wondering, which is, when will we know what impact that debate had? When will we get polls that... Will we know what impact that debate had? When will we get polls that really reveal that?
If any, I think it'll be next week, towards the end of next week, and I'll tell you why. First is contextually, if you look at post-debate, immediate post-debate polls from 2016, from 2020, past years, you've mentioned there have been times when you saw winners or perceived winners of debates, including the fact that in 2016, a lot of people thought that Hillary Clinton was winning some of those debates. And ultimately, that didn't pan out when Election Day rolled around. So those polls have some value, but it's limited, number one. And number two, you have to remember that the audience for those debates is large, but it's often disproportionately older. And so as younger people, and we know they're getting their information from a lot of different sources, that's going to trickle out over days. They're going to be getting information from the internet, from family and friends, et cetera. So that takes a while to process. And that's why I think you want to see that measurement in a few days. But finally, let me say this. There isn't a lot of room to move in this electorate. In our polling, the numbers of people that we think are persuadable by even the most generous measure is less than 1 in 10, and it may be smaller than that. So the question is, how many of those people are really watching to be moved in one direction or another? And frankly, that number is fairly small. We'll see, but that's the context, Ross.
Really, really helpful. Again, Anthony Salvanto, CBS News polling director. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, there are really two things that we're trying to understand as this campaign plays out. Which way will the voters go, of course, but also how many of them will turn out. Turnout is going to be a crucial factor too. Do remember there's more detail on all of the subjects we've considered in the last half an hour on the BBC News app and website. We'll see you back here in half an hour. But for the moment, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Hello there. It was an unseasonably chilly start to Friday morning with a touch of frost for some, but lots of blue sky and sunshine throughout the day, and we started to draw in that warmer feeling air. Now that trend is just set to continue over the next few days. So warmer by day, milder by night too. For the weekend, some sunshine, but also some outbreaks of rain here and there too. And you can see all of the sunshine clearly with the lack of cloud on the satellite picture here. We will see this front just gradually continue to push its way further eastwards through the rest of the night, bringing outbreaks of rain across Northern Ireland and western Scotland. More cloud here too, and some of the cloud will seep down into northern England. It's windy out towards the northwest, but look at much of England and Wales, dry with clear skies again. And while it's not quite as cold as it was last night here, then temperatures rurally could still drop perhaps as low as 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. And then on Saturday, we're set to keep a lot of that sunshine across England and Wales through the day. It will stay dry here, more cloud towards the north and probably some more in the way of high cloud through the afternoon, turning the sunshine hazy. Meanwhile, across Northern Ireland, Western Scotland, we'll see outbreaks of rain push eastwards. Taking their time to reach eastern Scotland, dry here for much of the day. Windy across the border, fresh southwesterly wind, highs of 16 to 19 degrees Celsius, so already feeling warmer. And then on Sunday, our front continues to slip southwards and eastwards across from northern England down through Wales, the Midlands and eventually into southeast England. But there will be some sunshine ahead of our front. It will stay dry during the daylight hours, 20 degrees, so warm, and sunshine developing behind the front too, with some showers scattered across northern and western Scotland. So here's our area of high pressure that's going to keep us largely dry and settled into next week. It's gradually pushing further eastwards over the next few days. But on Monday, we could start off the day with those lighter winds with some areas of mist and fog that could take a little time perhaps to lift and clear through the morning, but they will do so and there'll be some sunshine emerging and temperatures will be higher. So we're looking at 15 to 21 degrees Celsius, perhaps at north to south. And those temperatures could rise even further, low to mid-20s potentially, especially in the south as we head through the middle of next week. Lots more sunshine to come.
We're going to start with what's happening when it comes to climate change.
We cannot normalize this.
This is going to appeal to more people than just his base.
And that's really the nub of this. The hard part comes next.
That gift of panda diplomacy.
But this is the first time we've done this in modern history.
And we're going to say unprecedented a lot.
The news is just words without the context.
And this is the context.
Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Morning. Come and have a seat. Now, of course, I'm not going to go easy on you. There are some really big questions we've got to try and get answers to this morning. But I'll be fair, and we just want to hear what you've got to say. So, shall we get on with it?
We're rolling.
Here we go. Join me to hear from the biggest names inside and outside politics.
Sunday with Laura Koonsberg. Sundays at 9 on BBC One and iPlayer.
Ukraine is just about holding the front here while the Russians have launched this fresh assault.
Everywhere you look, there are uprooted trees, there are bits of building, and the destruction is just in every direction.
Incendiary drones were dropped here. We know this was the military junta because the rebels don't have that kind of weaponry.
While you can hear the tear gas canisters being lobbed at the protesters.
There when the story breaks. BBC News. Follow on the app.